A large-scale Russian invasion ruined lives of millions of Ukrainian families. For many decades, for millions of Ukrainian men and Ukrainian women, winter will be associated with the beginning of the most terrible page in the recent history of Ukraine, a full-scale war with Russia, rather than with a New Year, Christmas, or merry celebration. February 24. Morning. First explosions. First air alarm sirens. First wounded and dead civilians. Kyiv region, Sumy region, Chernihiv region, Kharkiv region, Donetsk region, Luhansk region, Zaporizhia region, Kherson region. The highest political and military command of Ukraine, as well as our defenders, were ready for this attack and engaged with the invaders.
Today, Russia started an invasion of Ukraine. Putin started a war with Ukraine, with the whole democratic world. Together, we must save Ukraine, save the democratic world. And we will do it. Glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini.
However, most civilian Ukrainians were caught off guard by the Russian invasion.
A real war. Everything is shooting, everything is flying. Fighters are flying, explosions, fire. That was our feast day. Fear.
Until the last second, we couldn't believe that this could happen to Kharkiv. We thought, such a beautiful, big city, it's impossible.
Someone met the beginning of a full-scale war just about waiting for a new addition to the family.
The war caught me in the penultimate week of pregnancy.
And someone just held a magical art event and was returning home with pleasant impressions.
We listened to music, drank tea, talked, and then we went home, went to bed. But there was some anticipation when we all sat there and watched the tea ceremony, the lighting, and felt a pleasant vibe. I watched and thought, this feeling, as if it's the last time we're sitting there, is so cool that we can finish everything already.
Someone had to completely stop doing their own business in the first days of the Russian invasion.
On the fifth day, we closed all our establishments and they are still closed today.
And someone immediately felt called to help the state and joined the volunteer movement.
From the very first days, we started collecting aid for the Kherson and Mykolaiv directions as a school, because it was a convenient place to bring things there. Those included food, clothing, everything that the fighters needed right away, but there was no supply. We baked, shaped and collected there. Everything that people could carry, they carried. So we assorted it out there and took it all to the fighters. We had guys from the territorial defense. We collected glass bottles so they could make Molotov cocktails. Everyone was walking around the houses looking for something to stop them with.
Each Ukrainian has met and is experiencing this terrible war in different ways. But all the Ukrainian people together and each of their representatives individually write their own biography of my war. The capture of part of the Kyiv region by Russian troops in 2022 and the atrocities they committed after that were a real shock to the whole world. At the time of the beginning of the Russian invasion, Olesya Karanyuk, a resident of Irpin, was 9 months pregnant. Just before the start of the war, the young and active resident of Irpin was expecting a child and had many plans for the future.
I am from Irpin, and for the last 5 years I had been actively engaged in public work, popularizing a healthy lifestyle in Irpin. I have a public social project, Territory of Sports. We provided everyone with the opportunity to play sports for free. In addition, I have a charity and volunteer project, Help a Specific Person. I helped seriously ill children. I also worked with women, We have a public organization, Dear Trans-Irpinia. My team and I united active women around us, and each of them was responsible for their own field of activity. My focus was sports, youth policy, and work with children.
The woman spoke about the decision to leave the city half an hour before the occupation, about the fear and anxiety that she experienced at that time, and how her life changed after this incident.
We stayed in Irpin until March 4, and in fact, it was the day of occupation of Irpin. That was the last week of my pregnancy, and my main task was to stay calm under these conditions. After all, the worst thing that could happen to me was contractions in the basement, and I understood that no one would provide me with medical assistance, because by that time we were disconnected from communications. There was no electricity, water, there was no connection with outside world, and I already realized that we would not get to the hospital because contractions usually starts at night, and at night traffic is prohibited. That is a curfew, and even if contractions start and it is possible to get to the Warsaw maternity hospital, we would not able to because of the curfew. They would immediately open fire on us. I woke up and said that we should leave here because we didn't know what would happen next. And this was probably a woman's intuition because I still wanted to stop by our apartment. Poor thing, I was dressed in my husband's clothes because we actually lived for 9 days without water, without the means of civilization. We just went out, got into the car, and at that moment a mortar attack began. For the first time I heard the whistle of mines in our direction, that is, they were enemy shells. Mines. I say, what are we going to do? And they just put me in the car and we started driving through Dmitrivka.
At that time, the road by which Olesya left was not occupied by the Russians, but the column of Russian equipment was already very close.
We started driving through the village of Dmitrivka, but no one was driving along that road anymore. Pieces of burnt iron were laying around, and civilian cars were burnt. We tried to drive fast due to a frenzied shelling, but we couldn't, because the asphalt was damaged and we could get a flat at any time. Then we had to stop. Therefore, we tried to drive as carefully as possible and managed to go to the Zhytomyr highway, the main artery of the Vinnytsia-Kyiv highway. There, in the village of Stoyanka, the bridge was blown up and we had to go around that bridge. We drove along the contraflow lane. Imagine, it was a 3-lane track, but without any cars. No one was driving because it was dangerous. We drove along the contraflow lane past the checkpoint of our Ukrainian military in the village of Horanechi, and through Horanechi we left the northern part of the Kyiv region. Up to the Makarivsky district we heard explosions. In fact, it took us 6 hours to leave the Kyiv region. Also, this is just 100 kilometers. Later, on the phone, we found out that a hour later we were followed by a column of Russian tanks that completely occupied Irpin. That is, we left the village of Dmitrivka on the Zhytomyr highway, and while we were driving along the contraflow lane, a Russian column was moving opposite on the right, and the occupation of the city had already begun. An hour later, the Russian military entered the house that we had previously been hiding. According to the owners of the house, the Russians put everyone who was in the house on the floor. At that time, there was also a child of our friends. They undressed all men looking for tattoos that might indicate that the guys belonged to the veterans of the ATO or territorial defense. They took out all the equipment and laptops from the house and left people alive.
Olesya and her husband may have been the last to leave Irpin before the occupation and not suffer. However, people who tried to escape along this route later did not succeed.
By the evening, I found out that my neighbor was living by the same road that we were living, and their family was completely shot. They were living through Dmitrivka when there was already a Russian checkpoint there, because when we left, they secured a position at the entrance to Irpin, and the Russian military was already controlling the checkpoint there. My neighbor from my section was living with his family. The Russians shot the car at the point-blank range, and the neighbor was killed. His wife and son were injured, but they survived.
Spring 2022 was supposed to be the happiest in Olesya Karanyuk's life, because at that time her first child, her son, was supposed to be born. In the end, the spring became the most terrible memory in her life, as well as in the lives of millions of Ukrainian men and Ukrainian women.
I'd been looking forward to that spring so much that I'd be walking around with a stroller here. Here I drank coffee. Here I walked and dreamed that soon I would be walking here with my son. Then I saw the shoot children laying in these places. Other people fled, sought salvation. They fled from the war. And civilians shot by the Russians lay in these places. My house was also damaged on March 4. Photos of our complex were also spread all over the world. Our apartment is also damaged, as is the house itself. It was on March 4 that it was sheltered from heavy artillery, and now we're trying to rebuild it on our own.
After everything she'd experienced, the woman reached her parents' village, which is in the south of the Vinnytsia region, and gave birth to a boy in less than a week.
We came to my home village in the Shagara district, 30 kilometers from the border with Moldova. During the first 2 months, I was still emotionally crushed, even though I was always convinced that I had a strong core. I never considered myself a weak woman, but still, the war broke me inside. I cried a lot, and I still can't talk about all these moments calmly, because I love it been very much.
Most of the Kherson region, as well as the city of Kherson itself, were under occupation in the first days and weeks of the full-scale war. Kherson is the only regional center that the Russians managed to capture during this war. People who lived this terrible experience told us about their life in the occupation. Having established the occupation regime in Kherson, the Russians introduced inhuman rules for living in the Kherson ghetto. People were practically unable to move around, and traveling to the free part of Ukraine was an extreme risk to their lives. Victoria Makarova and her son Mikita spent a month in occupied Kherson and recalled those times with horror.
Your phone shouldn't have the DIA app, a photo of armored personnel carriers, or anything else in correspondence. You shouldn't have said they were bad. Ukrainian music.
That is, if they found out Ukrainian song in the phone that was inappropriate.
They brought armored personnel carriers, trucks, and armored vehicles. Tiger. They had searchlights. They would drive and point them to the windows. If they saw someone, it was not clear what would happen.
They aimed the machine guns and could shoot. Apparently, they were afraid that someone could record where their equipment was going. That is, if there is no light in the window, but if they point a searchlight and tease that someone is standing
there, they could just shoot at the window?
Right. Very often they would take people away. They were looking all over the city first of all for activists who were at the rally, then former ATO participants, police officers, probably people related to the civil service and law enforcement. Apartments were broken down, even if no one was there, just arrived on 2 Tigers, sometimes on civilian cars. They came and broke doors down with automatic weapons. In addition to the fact that they completely robbed the house, anyone was there, they took those people away.
Inna Misenko, a school teacher, also told us about the occupation of her native village in the Kherson region.
But one day, about 2 weeks after the start of a full-scale war, the enemy came to us at night, and they first settled in the school. Those who lived on the outskirts of the village began to say that they saw an enemy columns of equipment driving at night. I went to school on duty and realized the reality when buses full of invaders drove into the school stadium. The highest rank was the battalion commander, and when he came out, he asked for someone with whom he could negotiate. To our question, will this be negotiation where you say and we agree, or you just impose and we must fulfill it? He replied that if we don't jump above their heads, we could coexist peacefully. Those were the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic at first.
Teachers who worked at the school did not make concessions to the invaders, and despite the fact that the invaders threatened with weapons, they began to defend their rights.
We had a lot of counter questions for them, as well as they had for us. These were actually disputes about what they were going on our land at all. We had a rather emotional team and everyone was interested in this issue. And they replied, "Where have you been for 8 years?" And they began to treat him. "Look, you're standing there without weapons, while we are with the weapons. So let's not start a polemic." They let us take computer equipment. We caught books out of school. We took it all out. That is, those teachers who dared to go there. After that, everything that we left there, everything that we did not manage to take out, they took for themselves. Later, when the Russians came together with their Kurds and Burats, roadblocks were placed around the entire territory of the village, and the village was temporarily banned from traveling. They were self-sustaining, which means they ran and took food from people.
And what did it look like? They came to the yard and said, "Give us everything"?
Yes, in fact, this was the case. These are people who understand their quantitative superiority, plus they have weapons. And they would say, "Look, who you are quarreling with."
So they threatened you?
Sure, at first they tried to be even loyal, but when the Russians came and not the so-called Lugansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic, they began to implement an aggressive policy.
Vera Antonova, a resident of the legendary village of Chernobyevka in the Kherson region, also recalls how the Russian invaders switched to self-sufficiency and took food from local residents and took them to prison.
They were given ration for exactly 3 days. After 3 days, they walked around our village and asked for food. It's like the Bermuda Triangle: military unit, military airfield, civilian airport Kherson, and it was all on the outskirts of our Chernobyevka. Now, the civilian airport is bombed. There was a torture chamber and much more.
Did the invader take people in this chamber?
Yes, they were captured and taken away. Some people are still missing.
Vera recalls how the invaders directly shot 2 guys from an armored car in their village.
On the first day of the occupation, 2 young guys were shot by the invaders from an armored vehicle in plain sight. Apparently, the guys said something to them, and these guys were shot. Girls were taken into their cars. Just before the war, on the 23rd of February, my daughter handed over her passport to replace her last name, and her passport was taken away. And you are nobody without a passport. You don't have a photo or any ID on your birth certificate. So it didn't come out at all during that month that we were in the village, because the invaders stopped people in the middle of the street and checked their documents. People were released, taken away, and thrown into cellars somewhere. These are barbarians who robbed shops, took alcohol and cigarettes.
There were no borders to the Russian atrocities in Chernobyevka. At some point, the invaders went so far as to drive a tank into a local supermarket for looting.
In autumn, an ATV store was opened in our village. A tank drove into that ATV store and they started taking alcohol out. We organized a team of men who stood and did not let the invaders in. Those occupiers who got drunk, they said, "Lay down," lowered the muzzle of the tank and began to address men, humiliated them in every possible way, looking for bandarivtsi.
In Kherson itself, the Russian invaders interfered with the conduct of any independent business in every possible way, engaged in racketeering and demanded to obtain Russian documents for conducting activities by Ukrainian entrepreneurs. This was told by Kherson businesswoman Anna Voskoboynik, who had her own confectionery business in Kherson.
On the first day, we closed all our establishments, and they are still closed today. We opened one of our coffee shops a month and a half after the full-scale invasion began, and when Kherson was already occupied. We did this because our employees stayed there, who decided not to leave for that period, and they also needed a job. They wanted to work. And the residents of Kherson who stayed in the city told us to open up because there was not enough ice cream, confectionery, yogurts, young cheeses. There was a shortage of food, so our products were extremely necessary for Kherson residents. If you won't believe it, there were queues of Kherson residents before our shop, and there were a lot of reviews on our products. They said, "Thank you for working. That is a breeze of old life." Our pastry shop was open until September. In September, we received a letter from the occupation authorities stating that if we do not re-register to obtain Russian documents, they will introduce a temporary administration in our shop. I don't know what is meant. Probably that our shop would be closed. On the next day, we closed all our shops. All people businesses were closed there because it was necessary to obtain Russian documents. The atmosphere was terrible, and they probably did not notice us at first because our production was small. A small confectionery, coffee shop, while all large businesses were already forced to close from the first day, and they did not work.
Due to the unbearable conditions of occupation, many residents of the Kherson region sought to leave for the territories controlled by Ukraine, but it was extremely difficult to do so. The Makarovs remember leaving Kherson by the minute. This and the next 3 days were crucial for them.
The idea that we want to leave appeared almost in the first months. It was very difficult psychologically to be there. You are kind of at home, but you are not at home. That is very difficult psychologically. You are afraid for your child, for your husband, for your mother, for your grandmother, for all your relatives, because you don't know what's in people's heads. None of us wanted to live in Russia and could not even imagine that this could happen. We left to Davidov Broad. First, we wanted to go through Snegurivka.
But they blocked it there. They blocked the entrances because they were afraid of our military going on the offensive. They blocked it because there was fighting there.
And there they shot more often at the cars of civilians who were leaving, because there were more Chechens in that direction. For example, a column of people could start out. We didn't have official green corridors. We were living at our own risk. That is, people get in cars, we are driving, and then it is not known what will happen to us. We will stay alive or we will be shot. Because there were cases when columns were shot, people didn't escape. From May 1 to May 3, they completely turned off the connection. We didn't have any internet or mobile communications. Everything was completely blocked. First, we wanted to go on May 6, but they blocked the roads. They blocked the roads and didn't let anyone out. They neither let anyone in Kherson from the left bank, nor from Kherson to the left bank because of May holidays. They have a parade of red rug there, with red flags. They gathered and brought people from Crimea and held a miracle parade with song and dances. We found a driver who agreed to take us out. This guy had taken out 3 families. We were the third and the last people he took out because it was scary. They remember who's taking people out, but we are very grateful to him. We don't have our own car. If there were no such people, very many would remain in the occupation and would not be able to leave.
Overall, the family passed 67 checkpoints where they were stopped at every 4 or 5 checkpoints. After a long trip, the family had the last breakthrough. They were soon supposed to find themselves in the territory controlled by Ukraine, but their fate was still in the hands of the invaders.
A car arrived. As I understood it, an officer and his subordinates came out of there. They went through the entire traffic jam with machine guns, counted us and said, "We will allow 200 cars at a time." And we were just within this first 200. Then they said, "Follow our car. We will go through mine."
To the gray zone, to the moment when their last checkpoint, and then there was a breach, and it was mine. Therefore, if they let you out, they will accompany your column, so to say.
But the Russians deceived people, sending them to their doom. The Makarov family escaped execution thanks to a mere chance.
The spare tires started to move away, and one of the drivers stopped us and said, "You are losing the spare tire now. Stop." And we stopped. Our driver fastened the spare tire. When we drove up to our first checkpoint in the gray zone, the vehicles were shelled. That is, the Russians let us go, but we and our roadblocks were shelled.
After you, right?
Yes,
What were they firing from? Artillery?
Either from mortars or artillery.
So the fact that you stopped saved your life.
yes, because there were victims among those who were in the head of the column. A 70-year-old woman and a child were taken to the hospital. Then they let 200 more cars out, Then they didn't let cars out for several days, and the last ones who passed through the Vida Broad, there were also several cars. They all were shot. I think there were about 30 cars. The Russians let people go just to shoot them later. After that, nobody drove this road.
The occupation of part of the Kherson region and Kherson itself in November 2022 was a real holiday and a harbinger of victory. However, after the retreat, the Russians left behind only death and destruction. The city of Kherson is still shelled daily by the Russian military.
The Ukrainian armed forces gained a foothold in our village for another 2 months, and this month that they were in the village, the Russians fired very hard at us. In fact, after they retreated, the Russians destroyed all the houses, trying to kill our fighters. In the neighboring villages, 70 or 80% of houses were destroyed. That is down to the foundation. You drive by and there is nothing. Therefore, the answer to the question of whether people will return to the villages of the Kherson region is that they will not return in the vast majority, because people have nowhere to return. They have and will have no money to rebuild their homes for.
Kharkiv is a city that was one of the first to meet the enemy during the full-scale Russian offensive on Ukraine in February 2022. Residents of the eastern outskirts of the city were the first to take on the enemy's attacks. Oleg Kalugin was one of those who lived on the eastern outskirts of Kharkiv before the start of the full-scale war.
Our house was like a magnet. It attracted everything. There were rumors that this house was the shield of the village of Zhukovsky.
Is it big and everything has flown there?
Yes, somehow it turned out that everything was flying into him. 2 to 4 were flying into other houses as well, and ours was specifically shot at. Fortunately, the house did not burn down.
Were there any casualties?
Most likely there were no casualties because it was the first house in front of Belgard, so everyone left. My neighbor lived there, and 1 or 2 other men.
So the border was near you?
We were 20 to 25 kilometers from Russia, but they approached us 5 kilometers away.
Oleg recalls that one day Russian rockets and shells caused flooding of one of the premises of a store where people were hiding in a bomb shelter.
A shell flew by the house 2 meters away. The main line was pierced, and the basement was flooded. People were hiding from shelling in this basement. They started calling me and saying, "We are flooding, what should we do?"
Oleg, who was no longer in Kharkiv at that time, could only see what was happening in the store with the help of surveillance cameras. Literally live, he saw people in the basement struggling with the danger of being flooded.
The flooding started, and people called in shock and asked what to do. I said, if possible, scoop up water with buckets. They scooped, but it didn't help much.
Were there many people there?
There were 20 to 30 people there usually. People were not only shocked that the projectile landed 5 meters away from them, but they also began to be flooded with water. Leaving was also not a solution because the shelling continued. I was scared for them, and even when I spoke with them on the phone, it was clear that people were in a deplorable condition.
In the end, people were able to get out of the trap only when there was a pause between shelling. However, rescuers could not reach the flooded basement for several more days. Russian aggression destroys not only the lives of Ukrainians, forcing them to leave their homes and seek relative security in Ukraine and abroad. Russians also destroy everything that people have earned and built at the cost of a lot of effort and time. Stanislav Srozenko and Bogdan Gvizdala are the founders of the Kololisu art space in Kharkiv. They said that they built the art space from scratch because the repair of a large room had to be done with their own hands.
We made repairs not just quickly, but extremely quickly. Within just 1 month, we made a renovation of the room of 230 square meters completely from scratch. There was no floor, and it was filled up with iron to the ceiling. We made a club, almost an art space, with our own hands. When none of us had been engaged in the repairs, we just wanted to. We built from morning to night, at night until 5 o'clock in the morning. In the daytime, workers worked for money. They poured the floor and so on. We arrived after our works at 5 o'clock in the evening and continued building until 5 in the morning. We worked like that every day, and in a month, we had it all repaired.
The last art event in the newly created Kololiso art space was held on February 23. It ended just a few hours before the start of a full-scale war.
And even on the last day of February 23rd, we had our last event in the evening. We held the tea ceremony. I poured tea. We had 15 people visiting. We listened to music, talked, and then we went home, went to bed. But there was some anticipation when we all sat there, watching the tea ceremony, the lighting, and feeling a pleasant vibe. I watched and thought, this feeling as if it's the last time we're sitting there is so cool that we can finish everything already. We even had the idea that we were happy with what we were doing in Kharkiv, and everything started to turn out. We got a big festival for 500 guests and found that place. Everything started to work. A cultural gathering point for all Kharkiv residents began to emerge. And we were going home thinking, well, we've already had a great life. We even thought so. Until the last second, we couldn't believe that this could happen to Kharkiv. We thought, such a big, beautiful city, it's impossible.
After the beginning of the Russian invasion, the art space in Kharkiv was closed for some time. Only sound equipment was removed from it. Stanislav and Bogdan still hoped that the room would retain its unique atmosphere and one day they would be able to simply insert the keys into the lock and return to their previous activities. But they soon found out that there was nowhere to go back.
2 Islander missiles directly hit our building, and the explosions were powerful. They hit this building right in.
So that's it. You can't restore anything.
Not at all. There was just a crater. There was nothing left of the entire 2-story building with thick walls, which had existed for more than 100 years. This was the historical value of those places, because our neighboring house was the first Kharkiv telegraph office, and we planned to expand in that direction. It was a 2-story house with 10-meter ceilings, a monumental building with a bunker, and that was an interesting place.
Destruction of educational institutions is another crime of the Russians in the war with Ukraine. The higher educational institution where Ukrainian law enforcement officers are trained in Kharkiv could not but interest the invaders, so the missile strikes on the university buildings were not long in coming. Valery Sokurenko, rector of the Kharkiv National University of Internal Affairs, told us about what the police university faced from the first days of the full-scale war.
The objects that I have shown you are destroyed, and this happened both in the first days of the war and later. We guard and protect everything. We took weapons and gathered people. We burned personal matters and state secrets so they would not fall into the hands of the enemy. No one understood how it would all turn out. There were personal data of our employees. Now, accordingly, there are certain uncomfortable moments that we have burned, and the enemy definitely has not got anything.
After February 24, 2022, the university was urgently relocated and its territory, academic buildings, dormitories and sports complex were soon destroyed by Russian missiles.
One of the dormitories was destroyed. It was destroyed completely. If you talk about it, you can see the remains of the furniture here.
Were there no people at that time?
No, people were evacuated at that moment.
And when did it happen?
It happened in the first days of March, but it was not limited to that. The next blow was already in August. Then the educational building, with the cadet dining hall and large lecture halls, was completely destroyed. 3 S-300 missiles.
From Russian territory?
Of course, it's very close. If you count in a straight line from Kharkiv to Horlivka, it's 26 kilometers.
Criminal proceedings have been initiated regarding Russia's shelling of university buildings. Property losses themselves are estimated at more than 6 million hryvnias, and this is just the tip of the iceberg.
What is depreciated, what is destroyed, and what is left will have to be written off after the criminal proceedings are over. The SBU is investigating the criminal proceedings today because it's a war crime.
Is there any equivalent in money?
6 million hryvnias of destroyed objects. But this property alone is worth 6 million. And the destroyed premises are worth more than 200 million. Today, it is more than 200 million. But this is a preliminary estimate. It is what they damaged in the Kharkiv National University of Internal Affairs. The investigative task forces made the assessment, but there is still our separate unit in the Volchansk district, the Yantar base. There are destroyed holiday homes, refrigerators, stoves, and kitchens are burned. An assessment has not been carried out there because it has not been demined yet.
The Russian invaders failed to capture the indestructible city of Kharkiv, so their revenge is still being converted into rocket and artillery strikes on the city. Residents of the Donetsk region faced the war at its beginning, back in 2014. However, even those people who were used to living in the close proximity to the front line during the ATO and JFO could not live in the realities of a new, much more brutal and destructive phase of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Two families from the town of Krasnohorivka near the front line in the Donetsk region were forced to flee from the Russian world and leave their hometown and homes. The mother of one of the families, Natalia Pastushenko, spoke about how the Russian military systematically destroyed civilian infrastructure in Krasnohorivka.
They hit schools, hospitals, and residential buildings of civilians.
Which school did they hit?
School number 2 was hit and the building burned down. It had only been recently restored after shelling and they hit it again. Everything burned down. The technical school where the children started also burned down. All our schools were burned down.
How many schools did you have in the city?
There were 5 schools.
Were there also incoming shelling of hospitals?
Yes, now we can't find our medical records there.
Natalia Pastushenko told us a terrible story that happened to her friends.
My young friend and her husband came to feed the dog in Haharina Street, and when the shelling started, they decided to stay there and go home in the morning. In the morning, the neighbors no longer had a house, they were killed. People were taken out from under the rubble, dismantling the house brick by brick. The man was found dead in the morning, and the woman died on the way to the hospital.
Natalia still keeps in touch with friends and relatives who stayed in Krasnohorivka. According to her, the town is constantly shelled.
We call my sister, who stays there. She says that a friend was wounded. His legs were cut off by shrapnel and he's in the hospital in Kurahovo. The neighbors across the street were directly hit and our framed windows were blown out. Neighbors who look after the house and feed the dogs say that people engaged in theft come to our house.
And what about the house across the street that was directly hit?
Telegram once stated that there is no garage or half of the house there.
The experience of living in a frontline town was particularly traumatic for Natalia's children.
The children were afraid. One day we would get up at 5:30 or 4 in the morning and once to the basement were rushes. They were afraid if there was a crash somewhere, we were already falling to the floor, so that if the wreckage would fly in, we should at least lie on the floor so as not to get too injured because the debris flew into the roof.
The second family has a similar history. They also moved from Krasnohorivka to the Vinnytsia region. Oleg Golenishchenko and Nadia Predko have 5 children, with whom they had to flee from Russian shelling of the town.
It was just the month of May. Shelling of private sectors and homes had already started. Previously during shelling, homes were not hit. The shells would fall somewhere in the fields. And then they started at home, the neighboring streets. There were attacks from Donetsk.
According to Oleg, the destruction due to Russian shelling was observed even before the full-scale invasion. Since 2014, the Russians have periodically shelled Krasnohorivka. Because of the shelling, Oleg himself even was wounded with shrapnel in 2015.
The Vonik church used to be there. It was hit and the building is completely destroyed. Only the foundation remained. There were a lot of hits to the hospital both in 2015 and 2016 during the war. And there were rebuilds, and a new roof was made, the windows were changed, and the therapeutic department was repaired. The destruction was very great. I was also wounded in 2015. A shrapnel wound, a mine exploded nearby. I went to work, which was a little further from the contact line, about 25 kilometers. There was shelling near our institution. The windows at the headquarters flew out. I was standing near the house when I heard something was flying. and there was a young guy who studied at the school. I pushed him into the entrance and followed him, and then I felt something had flown by and back.
Raising 5 children, Nadia Plutko is engaged in needlework. She makes souvenirs and jewelry, which brings additional earnings for the family. Nadia continues the business together with her children after moving from Krasnohorivka. Both families live in the same house, which was provided to them by volunteers. The kids go to a local school, play sports, and got a dog. However, the war has left traces in the souls of each of them. The fortress city of Bakhmut has lived at the turn of the war since 2014, but with the full-scale Russian invasion, it immediately turned into a military arena not suitable for civilian life. Artur Radkovsky is an international master of sports in wheelchair dancing. In his native Bakhmut, he played basketball, table tennis, and coached people with disabilities. Artur told us how the Russians turned the once flourishing city, which was the center of Paralympic sports in Ukraine, into continuous ruins.
The first serious shelling was on March 28th, when the rocket hit the parking lot where people were standing. I went outside on March 28th. The weather was nice and sunny. I was going to the stadium for training, and the rocket hit some 150 meters away. The blast wave threw me out of the wheelchair under the fence. There was a roar, pieces of concrete, flying fragments. The door of my house was thrown away.
Did it all come from the blast wave?
Yeah.
Were you injured?
No, I quickly rolled over under the fence, covered my head with my hands.
After the outbreak of active hostilities, all residents of Bakhmut were in grave danger. Artur recalls how many times he witnessed strikes on Bakhmut.
One day, while I was driving, I looked at the hill which was behind the district as you go down to the center, and I could see and hear shells exploding in the fields. Flashes. It was from the direction of Volodymyr, in the Novolinsky direction. When the fighting was going on, it was clearly visible who was shooting from where and what weapons were used. When planes or helicopters were shooting, it was accompanied by a very strong rumble in the ears, and during a serious shelling, I was almost deaf. The pressure in the air was huge from the blast wave, and my ears were injured. 1, 2, 3 concussions. What's the difference? I stopped counting. For several days, I felt pain in my head. My ears were blocked. The pressure from the explosion itself was more scary than flying concrete or fragments. And as I said, our door in the house was blown out with a lock, like the door in the attic. And I couldn't understand how the blast wave could have gone through the iron gate fence, the garage, and blow out the door. Thank God did this not happen when we were there.
And later you were shown?
Yes. When my niece lived in Artemis, Bakhmut, and there was shelling over the area where she lived, they were hiding because everything started burning, smoking, and flaring up after shelling.
After everything he has experienced, Artur Radkovsky does not lose heart and continues to work on his achievements in sports. He actively trains, prepares for wheelchair racing competitions, and goes abroad to championships. Fleeing from Bakhmut, he left all his medals and cups behind, but has already won several new ones. The widespread Russian invasion ruined lives of millions of Ukrainian families, but it did not break their spirit and faith in the future. Despite everything they have experienced, Ukrainian men and women continue to smile, continue to believe in victory and recovery after the war.
I am Ukrainian. We are very indestructible. We are very resistant. I can't be weak because I have a family that needs me, that needs support. Moreover, we have people who have suffered very much, but they are terribly worried about our fighters. I am engaged in volunteering, and the main part of those donations, they come from my friends. I know how difficult it is for them to bear all these issues financially, but they can at least send food. At a very rapid pace, local authorities began to restore the city. In fact, within the first month, basic communications appeared. Water, power, and gas supply were restored within months. Today, according to the information I have, up to 70% of the residential apartment buildings in the city has been restored. Irpin is rapidly rebuilding. Of course, we will restore everything in Kherson. rebuild it. The most important thing is to defeat the enemy and return to our homes. Liberation is when there is no gap, no oppressions. You do not walk under machine guns. You feel freedom. It was impossible to get out. You did not feel free. It was not slavery, but some kind of yoke. And when the village was liberated, it was a holiday. Flags were dug up. Our head of the House of Culture said, "I didn't remember where I buried the flag, but when we were released, I remember it."
Every day, the Ukrainian Defense Forces fight and shed blood for our security and future. The fact that we can tell the truth about the crimes of the Russians in this war is only their merit. Every Ukrainian man and every Ukrainian woman together bring our victory closer. On the front line or in the rear, at the machine gun or at the laptop, on the economic, cultural, sports, informational, diplomatic, and of course military fronts, we all write a biography of our war. The biography of our war is written not only by Ukrainians, but also by all foreign friends who help us and put great efforts for our common victory.
I've spent 6 years in the United States Air Force fighting for the same freedoms that Ukraine is fighting for now. That's why, when the Russian Federation began an illegal invasion and aggression on February 24th, it reminded me of the reasons I joined the United States Air Force. For a lot of American veterans that I communicate with, the values that we hold dear as American military members, those are the same values Ukraine is fighting for today. So that's why I came here, to see if I could help with what I've been taught by the U.S. military. I lived in Fargo, North Dakota, and I will apply for a permanent residence permit in Ukraine in order to stay here until victory.
My role and the role of my organization and my colleagues is to do everything we can to support temporarily displaced Ukrainians. We feed thousands of refugees every week with products that we are bringing in from the UK. In addition, there are organizations, one of which I'm not even allowed to talk about, from America, that they've sent £5 million worth of sports equipment, which we are systematically handing out to refugees who came with nothing.
With such dedicated and motivated allies as Mark and Chris, as well as thousands of other organizations and millions of other caring people around the world, we are getting closer to victory every day. However, this victory comes at the cost of thousands of Ukrainian military casualties on the battlefield and hundreds of civilians killed by Russian missile attacks. It is true that today the provision of modern combat aircraft to Ukraine is requested by everyone and his brother, but it is a step that will really help protect the civilian population and military infrastructure of Ukraine from Russian missile strikes. A legendary fighter pilot of the Air Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine with the call sign Karaya daily defends the Ukrainian sky on an old Soviet MiG-29 fighter. He explained why Ukraine needs weapons like F-16 so much.
With regard to airspace control, there are 3 key elements. These are ground-based radar stations that can early detect enemy aircraft and any enemy air defenses at long distances. The second ground component of air defense is ground complexes. And the third, of course, aviation. At the moment, we have radar stations, that is, a continuous radar field. The ground component of air defense, namely air defense systems, we have thanks to our Western partners. Now we have modern systems, such as the Patriot complex, the best air defense system in the world, as well as NASAM's IRIS-T. We now have the most advanced and most modern air defense ground component in the world. And that's incredible. And unfortunately, we have a problem with the third component, namely the aviation component. Why? If we consider the general airspace of Ukraine, the work of fighter aircraft is aimed at destroying enemy aerial targets, such as cruise missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles. At the time when the MiG-29 Su-27 fighter was being developed, then there were simply no such air targets, and therefore the characteristics of the onboard radar station did not allow them to be effectively detected and destroyed. In order to effectively work on such air targets, it is necessary for the maximum number of circumstances to destroy such targets to coincide. Everything from the weather conditions to the skills of the crew commander or pilot of the given aircraft is affected. F-16 aircraft have this capability. Their radar stations allow detection and destruction of small air targets. This is if we take the general airspace of Ukraine. If we take the line of combat, then it is impossible to make a solid anti-aircraft defense on the entire territory of Ukraine. Because, first of all, the country is large in area. Each air defense complex has its own range of destruction of air targets. If you imagine a map of Ukraine, for example, there is one complex here, and it has its own radius, or roughly speaking, circles are placed over the territory of Ukraine. Of course, there is a certain distance of areas not covered by ground-based air defense systems, and fighter aircraft in particular, due to their mobility, cover open areas and can work on air targets that do not have a zone of damage by the ground-based air defense systems. And the third main one is the destruction and work along the line of battle.
At the moment, due to the superiority of the Russians in air technology, there is a situation where Russian aircraft can attack us while being out of reach of our means of destruction.
For example, the enemy uses Su-30SM and Su-35. The Su-30SM operate maximally in comfortable conditions at an altitude of 5,000 to 6,000 meters. They detect us at a range of more than 200 kilometers and can attack us at a range of 75 kilometers. This is the actual range of the R-77-1 missile. Of course, the Russians have the latest and very dangerous R-37M missiles. However, we do not consider them yet because their number is so small. So this does not allow to change the situation in the airspace in their favor. But despite all of this, we can only see 70 kilometers against the enemy, and they can see us 200 kilometers, and we can carry out an attack on an enemy air target at a range twice smaller than them. Therefore, in order to get closer to the enemy, we fly at extremely low altitudes, working in the zone of damage of ground-based air defense systems, and of course, being hit by their fighter aircraft.
According to the pilot, it is the transfer of modern fighters like F-16 to Ukraine that can correct this situation.
But everything can change completely when our detection range of enemy air targets will be greater than theirs, and the launch range of air-to-air guided missiles will be further than that of the enemy. That is, we will be able to work without entering the zone of action of enemy air defense. Of course, their fighter aircraft extend further in relation to the combat collision line, and we will also be able to work on strike aircraft without any problems. This means attack aircraft of the Su-25, Su-24, Su-34 bombers, and of course, helicopter aircraft of the K-52, Mi-28, Mi-8, and others.
The entire civilized world has united for the victory of Ukraine. And for this victory we need to take a few more extremely important steps. Today, Ukrainian men and women are at the forefront of Russia's war against Ukraine. The war of totalitarianism against democracy, fear against pride, and slavery against freedom. We call on all those who cherish the common values of democratic freedom with the people of Ukraine to join in common efforts for our common victory.